Yeah, we'll just get started. I'm Rachel Bergstrom. I'm an associate professor in the biology department, and I also teach for health and society. I teach especially emerging diseases. Welcome to this semester. All right, Ron, go ahead.
So I'm Ron Watson. I'm an associate professor for political science and health and society. I'm also the co-chair of the health and society program and one of the coordinators of our health and healing channel.
We have two guests with us today. Kristen Labby, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kristen Labby, assistant professor in the chemistry department, also part of the health and society program. And I'm currently teaching a capstone course called Next Generation Antimicrobials.
Nice.
All right, and Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Chen. I'm in political science. I am tangentially related to health and society because I teach one of the sections of Political Science 201, which is the methods class that also counts in HEAL. And I think I'm here to talk conspiracy theories and misinformation and the politics of COVID-19.
We can't wait for you to give it to us, Phil.
Excellent. So we start out our show each week with a check-in because we're all humans and we're all living through the same uncertain times. So Ron, what have you been up to this week that's been keeping you relatively sane?
Well, in addition to more sort of connections with folk, one of my brothers who I don't talk to a lot sort of reached out to me, so that was really nice. I started reading the book that I said I would, right? So I'm starting to read I've watched The Expanse in its visual form, and now I'm reading the book. So yeah, that's been cool.
Excellent. And Kristen, what have you been doing this past week to keep yourself moving forward?
Well, I continue to teach from home. I guess I would just say I'm fortunate to have a medium-sized home. I'm not stuck in a small apartment. That's one of the things I reflect upon. And I'm also fortunate that my young daughter is still able to go to her small daycare. Nice. So I'm teaching uninterrupted. I don't have a little toddler or a preschooler interrupting me. But spending my time, I really like getting outside with her. I'm also fortunate to have a neighborhood that is not too crowded. I can get out and walk and bike freely.
Yeah, that getting out of the house makes such a difference, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Insane.
It's critical. Very critical.
And Phil, what are you keeping up with these days?
Keeping up with Rosie, our 13 months, right? Yeah, 13 and a half month old daughter. Melanie and I have been sort of trading off. Melanie, my wife, is an occupational therapist and hasn't been able to work too much, but they're just starting teletherapy. So she's been doing some teletherapy. So we've been trading off with Rosie. And we discovered that the coffee shop, Java Cat, down the road from us is still open for a drive-through or walk-through. So we've been taking some excursions down to their walk-up window, and that's a nice little outing to, I don't know, get out when it's nice and not snowing.
Yeah. Which seems to be actually, not very often, right?
Not very often right now.
Snowing literally almost every day. Thank you, weather.
Well, and I've been enjoying the weather too. Getting out every day has been nice for all of us. But so last week I said I was going to finish Tiger King, and I finished it. I don't know how I feel about it. We watched the follow-up thing, the interviews. That's a whole nother episode. But so we're gonna finish up The Expanse. That's one of our next goals, Ron.
And as soon as you finish, let's talk.
Yes.
I'm ready for this.
I'm on the waiting list for Leviathan wakes at the library now. So
all right.
So let's get started. So this time, since we're not on Zoom with the chat function available on Zoom, I have the Facebook page awaiting your questions and comments. And so I welcome you all to submit questions as we're talking. We'll be keeping up with those too. Ron, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, so yeah, man, obviously we have these two guests who both bring these very different perspectives to this whole issue, crisis that we're all dealing with. So I'm going to start with Phil. So Phil, you sort of teased us with the conspiracy theory thing. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and just allow myself to be teased further. So what sort of conspiracy theories are you here to sort of debunk around the coronavirus and COVID-19 and what happened?
Well, let me start by saying I'm not an epidemiologist by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm not going to try to debunk specific conspiracy theories. What I will say is I think what we can do is learn a lot from how conspiracy theories spread to think about who's likely to be endorsing these conspiracy theories and how they're going to spread. And I'm also fielding any ideas that you might have around this. I've got a survey going into the field with a friend of mine, a co-author of mine, and we can add in a few questions. We have a little space, and the survey is roughly around conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory endorsements. So our plan is to add in some questions around coronavirus and COVID-19. So if there are things that you've heard or that you specifically want to think about, we are happy to report back on any of that. But I think what we want to look at when we think about conspiracy theories and misinformation is the way that information spreads through social media, through trusted sources, and through the sort of networks of individuals. And so we don't see misinformation spreading across sort of ideological lines very often, because that's not where we see people who are trusting of sources. And so it tends to be sort of this reinforcing cycle of misinformation.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Rachel, you want to get Kristen in on this conversation?
Yeah, Kristen, so I mean, there's a lot of different directions we could go here, right? There's the thinking about what people are talking about for treatments for COVID-19, but I think also one of the ties into what Phil has just been talking about is what are some of the things that people are talking about for treatment of COVID-19 that maybe don't have support at this point, and then we can lead into the things that are in current clinical trials or things that your class has been looking at.
Right. At first, it seems like my discipline and Phil's would be a little bit different, but there is kind of an overlap around. We all want there to be a successful treatment. So once there's an idea or a theory of what could be that successful treatment, people might latch onto that and it propagates, even though there might not be solid scientific research that really supports that right now. I guess I could start talking in general about what's being explored. Sure. So first, I just wanted to say that what's happening initially is going to be looking at repurposing existing drugs, because that's going to be fastest. So scientists have developed several other antivirals, drugs that target viruses, and it's going to be most efficient to look to those to see if they would work for this novel coronavirus, a different type of virus than we've experienced at a large scale before and need an effective therapy for. So looking at repurposing, that would be beneficial because there's a lot of safety information around these drugs that are already in use. They've been known to be safe, they've been known to be effective, and they're already being made on pretty large scale in most cases, but we'd probably be talking about ramping up that scale of production. So maybe later we could talk about vaccines, that's separate, but right now, the first idea, the first promise was this combination of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. And that's that idea that got really latched onto as a promise and kind of propagated. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of sound science for that one right now.
Yeah, I've looked at some of the initial studies for that, and seen that, you know, there's a possibility that there is some promise to that. But I'm wondering if you could talk about specifically the early trials and versus perhaps the later, like what do we look for in numbers of people who are in these trials? Are we talking ones, tens, hundreds, thousands before it actually gets to a patient treatment? Because I think that in the study that I was reading, it was in the 10 to 100 range of number of patients included in that particular study.
Right. So you're talking about a study that may have looked promising, but one of the limitations would be not a lot of people were involved in that study.
Right. Exactly.
So exactly. Some of the things that are happening is there aren't solid control groups or comparison groups for these studies that show promise but need further investigation. So both in more people and having a good comparison.
Yeah.
A third thing that I've been noticing is some of the studies that are published that seem promising and then get promoted are all in pretty advanced cases of COVID-19. So people who are pretty ill and organs are failing, things are really going wrong. And it's pretty hard to tell if a drug is effective at that point. So some other studies might need to be done to show early stage treatment and the impact of that.
Do you think that it's an interesting idea that we're really just trying to treat really severe disease at this point? Do you think that that's linked to our approach to testing and some of the confirmation bias that we might have in only testing severe cases versus knowing what the actual burden of the disease is in the population?
Yeah, I think that's going to be part of why it's going to be hard to design scientifically sound clinical trials and get nice comparison groups, because it is hard to know who has COVID-19 in terms of the testing and in terms of all these people who may have it but be asymptomatic. What type of patients are going to be the best group for this? And this is where it's very collaborative, right? It is scientists, drug makers, but more so now we're talking about physicians and healthcare workers designing these studies and choosing the patient groups.
I have a question about this, actually. So in psychology, we talk about sort of domains of gain and domains of losses. And I wonder to what extent researchers who are looking into this are struggling with that as well, on sort of a selection bias of who's going to be willing to participate. So if you have a mild case, or if you are asymptomatic, or you have it but you are fine sort of self-isolating at home, is there, because we're jumping so many stages in I think some of these drug trials, is there a risk that there's a selection bias that's playing into what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. I see what you mean.
Yeah, I think you are getting at a good point. Who's going to be the available participants for the trials? And I think I'm actually going to say this is probably beyond my scope of knowledge. I'm a medicinal chemist who does like early round drug design and knows a lot about the drugs and how they work in the body. But who gets enrolled into clinical trials is really not my area of expertise, but this is why it's getting so complicated. These things can't be done quickly. It's going to take a little bit of time to design some scientifically sound clinical trials with those considerations.
And I think that actually leads into a question for Phil that's related. And Kristen, I do want to come back to some of the specifics about what's being tested right now. But we have a situation where we've got incomplete information. We've got incomplete information about who's infected. We've got incomplete information about the actual case fatality rate. We don't actually know 100%. There's been some different studies and different think pieces and different things on the news recently that I've heard about the 6-foot rule, right? And so Phil, I'm wondering about, we had a discussion in my emerging diseases class about this idea of conspiracy theories being kind of a hallmark, fundamental part of a pandemic, right, in the response to it. And so Phil, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how partial, incomplete information, or how do conspiracy theories start? How do some of the, what are some of the things that you've been hearing about conspiracy theories for COVID-19, or examples of conspiracy theories that you can kind of track back to their origin?
Yeah. So I think there's an important thing here to separate out the idea of sort of conspiracy theories from misinformation and from just incomplete information, right? I think when we're talking about drugs that may or may not work, we're really dealing in the realm of incomplete information, right? We don't know if they're working. And then there's misinformation, right? Information that is objectively wrong, but is being spread. And then we have conspiracy theories, which posit sort of an external actor, right? Somebody who's trying to do something or to sort of manipulate the situation. And there's a lot of meshing together, especially of misinformation and conspiracy theories. Right. And so we don't need to think of them as completely separate. But I think incomplete information, we use sort of a different social psychological approach. I should say my PhD is in political psychology. So I'm trained as a political scientist with a fair amount of social psychology. And so that informs a lot of my work. So when we're talking about incomplete information, people tend to fill in the rest of that information, and they fit things within their pre-existing notions, right? And so if you get new information, you tend to not accept that information objectively. You tend to fit it within your prior attitudes. It's something we call motivated reasoning, and specifically what's called directionally motivated reasoning. So when people hear new information and they have incomplete information, they tend to supplement that incomplete information in a way that confirms their previous beliefs. And so if your previous belief is that, say, that social distancing is unnecessary, new information is going to play into that. If your previous belief is we're not doing enough on social distancing, we have to double down on this, your new information is going to be fit within that sort of schema.
That seems really challenging.
It is.
Well, it definitely is on so many different levels. So, Rachel, is it all right then if I go to one of our questions here?
Sure, go for it.
So, and Phil, while we've got you, we'll just go to the one with you on here. So, we've got a question from Moy Yamazaki. And it was for both of us, but I'm going to let you go first on this. So Moy would like to hear our perspective on how this crisis may influence the next presidential election, as well as general health policy in the U.S. So yeah, Phil, how's it going to play out?
Well, I'm going to punt on general health policy to you, because that's really your area of expertise. I have thoughts, but that's really yours. I think electorally, who knows how it's going to play out. I think one of the things that actually is maybe not being talked about a lot is the fact that Donald Trump's political strategy is based largely around big mass gatherings. And to the extent that social distancing is going to be continuing into the fall, it actually has to change his campaign strategy, or he has to just openly violate many states' orders, right? And so there's a shift, there's a strategic disadvantage to the way that Donald Trump has tended to run his campaign, or at least he did in 2016, and we don't really see any reason to expect that he's going to take a different approach to his campaign in 2020. So there's a strategic aspect to it there. I think we know that the economy tends to be the number one driver of sort of movement within an election, aside from sort of long-term partisanship trends, right? So the economy, the rate of recovery of the economy will be a big piece of this. We're already seeing, approval ratings which had sort of gone up for Trump in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic are already going back down to sort of pre-pandemic levels, which in some sense is more of a comment on sort of the stickiness of Donald Trump's approval and disapproval than it is about the pandemic itself. So it's a long way to say, I think we're going to see a huge impact on the presidential election, but it's not as simple as saying, well, people are going to evaluate how the country is doing, and that's going to be how the president does. It's going to be tied to the economy. It's going to be tied to perceptions. It's going to be tied to the narrative, right? If the narrative becomes partisan, if social distancing becomes a partisan issue, which is already starting to, but
That's right.
there are, there's still Republican governors that are pushing back against that. If it really starts to divide on partisanship, then we're going to see a much different election than if we stay in this kind of middle ground of partisanship along the sort of responses to COVID-19.
Okay.
Ron, I'll let you take that policy because.
No, I mean, so yeah, I definitely, since we have more questions, I want to hear from Kristen as well. But yeah, I mean, general health policy, in some ways, I have almost the same answer. It's like, it depends, right? It's when we look back at some of the similar events, right? I mean, you think everyone sort of thinks back to like 1918 and the influenza epidemic that happened, or pandemic rather, that happened there. I mean, it changed some things, right? But it's sort of difficult to imagine that it changed society or led to any sort of general health policy that we even still recognize today. I mean, you would think in some ways, of course, the public health establishment absolutely learned a lesson from that, right? And you think about how assiduously people across the world were looking at H1N1 and avian flu when they first emerged. It certainly makes a lot of sense that in that sense, the public health establishment worldwide will definitely be paying attention. Will that translate into government action? That remains to be seen. In a certain way of thinking about things, all policy is health policy, right? And so in that sense too, you think about what sort of didn't happen this time, right? We weren't prepared for the sort of economic impact, for people losing their jobs. Weren't even really prepared that there were going to be people who could not stop working, right? I like to think that this will transform that sort of policy that is effectively still health policy, transform it in a way that'll make it safer for people in the future to have to, if they have to work, to be able to work with PPE, right? To have that personal protective equipment there with them and ready for them, or that we have decided, all right, everybody's going home no matter what. There's going to be a very small group of people who still are active, and all of our resources are going to be poured into keeping them safe. So that might happen, but again, it depends. Rachel, will you take our question for Kristen?
Yeah, Kristen, we have a question from Larkin Myers, who's actually going to be one of our alumni on tomorrow. We've got a recorded interview with her that we'll be sharing as part of our alumni special edition tomorrow as part of Community Day. So Larkin has a question about donated blood plasma as a possibility for treatment. And I think actually it might be useful, Kristen, to first talk about a little bit about what is available right now and what people are investigating for potential treatments for this. And then we can add the plasma option to that. Does that sound good?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, sounds good. Again, I guess it's a little hard for me to discuss this in great detail because I'm not a medical doctor and we're kind of going into that territory, but I can talk about, we were talking about chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, which are currently anti-malarials, also used for rheumatoid arthritis or lupus because they have some anti-inflammation, anti-inflammatory properties. And those are the ones that can get paired with azithromycin, an antibiotic.
An antibiotic for a virus?
Right. So that definitely perked my ears up too. And I think that's happening because these patients are so sick that secondary bacterial infections could set in. Or there's just some mystery synergism between drugs. Sometimes drugs work together in unexpected, unpredicted ways. So again, I guess I'm going to say this needs more investigation, more study, for sure. So that therapy sounds really promising, got covered a lot as could be a therapy, but I'm going to say it needs a lot more investigation.
Yeah.
Not even neither of those are actually even antivirals. So we need a lot more work there. Looking into repurposing some drugs that are antivirals, that seems to make a little more sense to me. It's drugs that are already used to treat viruses. Remdesivir is the one that's probably being investigated the most and furthest along in some studies. So it's an RNA polymerase inhibitor, I believe.
Ooh, so, cool.
Yeah. So that's gonna inhibit RNA.
I mean, if you need a room or something.
And the virus is RNA based. Okay, so it's going to target a mechanism that's important to the virus and viral reproduction. So it'll be virus specific. And this drug is in more and more clinical trials. So we might have some results on this maybe by summer or fall.
That's really quick.
Well, on these phase, I don't know what phase they're in, 2 or 3. Okay. So these are starting to be bigger groups of people, solid control groups, and things like that. Okay, so then there's some other antivirals getting explored in small studies. I'll move on to answering Larkin's question because in terms of time frame, I think this is a faster thing. It's happening now. It's happening already. Using the plasmid from recovered COVID-19 patients to treat current COVID-19 patients. So what would be happening there is patients who had it's called the SARS-CoV-2 virus would have made some antibodies specific to that virus, and those antibodies would still be present in those people's plasma. So if they donate their plasma and then pass it on to I'm sure there has to be some compatibility in terms of blood type and other things.
There actually doesn't, because all of the compatibility is on the red blood cell. So plasma, you can donate plasma to anybody.
Okay.
Cool thing.
Plasma.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Chemist, biologist.
The team effort here.
Yeah. So that's been used, I think, in other diseases. And there's a big study coming out of Johns Hopkins that has 40 hospitals involved, 2 hospitals in Wisconsin. People are getting tested for that. They need to be COVID-19 free for at least 14 days, tested for other diseases, and then they're starting to donate their plasma.
I think that one's fascinating because that was one of the early approaches for Ebola in the most recent enormous outbreak. They really were investigating that. What's fascinating about this plasma treatment option too is that it's actually a pretty old approach to treating diseases, and it's relying on the fact that we maintain immunological memory of our infections, and we produce a large amount of antibodies when we're infected, when we experience the disease, and they persist for a certain amount of time after that infection has cleared. And so I think that antibodies are going to be in the news for a while now. Not just because of the plasma treatment, but also because antibodies are one of the ways that we can screen the population to see who's been exposed. And as we approach this question of what is the actual burden of the COVID-19 epidemic in the United States, like many of us probably have been exposed and we're either asymptomatic or we're able to fight it off, we'll have that antibody memory and that ability to demonstrate that we have some immunity. So the NIH is currently they're enrolling people from across the country to do a study on this. They're sending out home blood collection kits, which as a former phlebotomist, I'm fascinated by it. But it really is.
Level was like off the charts for this. This is.
I know. But they're collecting micro amounts of blood to look for antibodies and I think it was like 10,000 patients from across the country is what they're trying to enroll to begin with, to find out what the rate of exposure was. So I think one other interesting thing about antibodies to think about is in most cases, for most diseases, that immunological memory leaves you immune to infection by that particular disease. Right. So we rely on this for vaccinations. So like measles vaccination, you're exposed to a live attenuated form of the virus that your immune system is able to fight off. You don't get measles, but what it leaves you with is an enduring immunity to the disease.
Right.
So for people in my generation, and I think most of the people on the screen right now, we had chicken pox when did everybody have chicken pox? I mean, that was a normal childhood illness. And now all of us have small children who will never have chicken pox. Yeah. But we have this immunity to chicken pox. Our children will get it through the vaccines that they're getting. And we're protected. But that's not actually the case for every single disease. There are certain diseases that it's possible to, after being infected, even though you have that immunological memory, you can have the disease again. And so one of the lingering questions right now, even within this study that Kristen's described, is that we aren't 100% sure that having the disease leads to long-term immunity.
Yeah, so that's what's going to be, I think, one of the, if we can at least get there, that'll give us some sort of calm and relief, right? So at least for those people who were sick, we can then sort of say, okay, at least they won't get sick with the same thing again, right?
Right. And so this is also related to, we have a comment from a parent too, that has been reading about the importance of contact tracing. And so especially as we're still working to figure out who's immune or is immunity possible or who's been exposed, this idea of contact tracing, paying attention to who you've been around 6 feet away for 10 minutes or more is what they're talking about right now. How do we use that to actually trace who's been exposed? So yeah, and that's a lot of work. So
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
There's a second point to Larkin's question about this antibody theory, that it's going to be pretty limited to come up with enough recovered COVID-19 patients and collect their antibodies. It's going to be a pretty limited treatment. So we would also want to think about things that could be more easily and broadly disseminated.
Yeah. It looks like there's 2 questions in here that fall squarely in Ron and Phil. Well, 3 questions now that fall squarely in Ron and Phil's area of expertise. So Ron, take it away.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and take it away. So let's, especially since Wisconsin just had this election last week. So how do we hold a national election during this time, right? During the time of this virus, right? Oregon has, the person said, Oregon has voted by mail for a long time, but could or would all states transition to this method in a matter of months? Phil, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think Wisconsin is a pretty clear example of no, states are not going. I mean, states could. Right? Yeah, states absolutely could, with the amount of time that we have now, between now and the November election. It's physically possible to print enough ballots to work. I mean, it's possible. I don't even think it's a particularly far-reaching administrative problem by November. But would they? I think the evidence is pretty clear. No. I mean, I think the evidence from Wisconsin is clearly no. I think the reason perhaps you've seen states, even states with Republican governors, being willing to delay the primary is because it's a Democratic primary and there's no challenge on the Republican side. And most of those states didn't have something like a Supreme Court election tied in with it, right? So there were different incentives in Wisconsin than there are in a lot of other states. I think that,
go ahead, Phil, sorry.
I think there might be some public pressure to push for this, but the question is that public pressure can't come in mid-October. That public pressure has to come now to give that administration of the election time. And I just don't think we're going to see that. And I think we've already seen Wisconsin is essentially the trial balloon for the legal cases for this and the sort of limits on executive power.
So, the Wisconsin election is really interesting for a number of reasons too, because, it could be the case that Republican strategists are now looking at this election and going, wait a minute, we miscalculated. And they may get the sense, and again, it's going to depend on the data that they see, but they may get the sense that they were punished for doing this, right? Because sort of people were widely upset about this idea of having to go and vote. And so you're telling us we can't go to the grocery store, but that we have to show up to vote, right? And it was pretty clear and clearly advertised which party actually pushed through with that. Right. Evers, as the Democratic governor, attempted to delay things. Right. And then, of course, there was a lawsuit and it was overridden effectively. Right. So he was overridden by Republican members of the legislature. So, at that, when we look at that, this may actually be the catalyst to get other states to say, OK, look, let's just all vote absentee this time. Right. But again, it remains to be seen. This is going to turn into an extraordinary election cycle. Especially if this virus and the situation lingers any further. We have a couple of other questions as well. Rachel, do you want me to go to one of those as well? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
So another one that's popped up here is about this partisan divide. And this person said that part of the partisan divide seems to be about when to reopen. And I would agree with that. It seems it's starting to emerge. If you were policy advisors, what would you be looking for as signs that it's safer to reopen? And this is the kind of question I ask my students now. They're like, what? What is you? Yeah, like I'm sitting here to myself like, what would I do? Phil, since you're the guest, you go first. What would you?
What I would do is I'd trust the people who have been doing this for their livelihood. Like, why? I mean, to me, this isn't I absolutely agree that the partisan divide is emerging around when to reopen, this balance of public health versus economy. But to me, I think the logic says you trust the people who are public health experts, right? Who tell you when it's safe. But that's not necessarily that's not the calculus that every politician is going to make, right? There is by nature sort of a trade-off that you're making, right? Because we know certain things. We also know that as the unemployment rate increases, deaths increase, right? Because people have food insecurity, people have job insecurity, they have higher levels of depression. So you can't say increasing levels of unemployment has no effect on public health either.
Exactly.
But we can be pretty certain that the effects of an overwhelmed healthcare system due to a sort of complete removal of social distancing is going to have a much more significant effect on public health than unemployment. The question is, where do you find that balance? And, I think a lot of people are saying we err towards the side of public health, public safety, right? And I think the markers for that are something actually that probably Kristen and Rachel know more about than us.
Well, and I mean, I think that leads into a question that I have for Kristen, which is, as a medicinal chemist, what are the things that you pay attention to as we're moving through this pandemic? What are the points that give you hope and excitement about our future of living with COVID-19? Because it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I do like to think about the positive, and what I've watched is these drug repurposing studies come out really fast and really collaboratively. I think there is unprecedented pace of science and collaboration coming out of this, and I think that's pretty cool and pretty positive. Once we learn about coronavirus, we're going to have that working body of knowledge for the next coronavirus.
Yeah.
But with that, the other science has been paused. So we're accelerating clinical trials around COVID, but new antibiotics, new cancer drugs, all of those other things, those have been paused a little bit while the focus is on coronavirus trials right now. So that's a little scary to see, but I'm going to try to focus on the positive of all the good science that's going on right now.
Well, I think it's a good opportunity for you to put in a plug for Tiny Earth, because you are engaged with Beloit students doing the work of antimicrobial discovery. And because we're off campus, that's paused. So tell us a little bit about Tiny Earth and how that works towards similar goals for treating diseases that are emerging and diseases that we're currently fighting.
Yeah, so my class right now is part of a worldwide collaboration of scientists and students working to discover new antibiotics from soil bacteria. A lot of drugs, especially antibiotics, are natural products from bacteria, fungi, and that sort of thing. So we're looking for new interesting molecules that could be medicines. But unfortunately, that was all focused on bacterial infections. And I was saying that kind of work is getting paused. And for me in my class, it literally was 7 weeks into the course. But fortunately, my class was actually titled Next Generation Antimicrobials, which is a term that would encompass fungal infections, bacterial functions, and viral infections.
Nice.
I don't know much about viruses, but now we are studying viruses in my course. But still, some of the techniques, the testing, the studies that are going to come out of this can be translated to other areas too, I think.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting class, and like you said, it's a worldwide network. So you have most of the people who are doing that are going to be microbiologists, but you have a really fascinating perspective on that as a chemist for thinking a little bit more mechanistically about how the drugs are working. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, we were actually going to start the next part of the course where I was going to use a little bit more of my chemistry expertise and do some organic chemistry techniques and start to try to figure out what molecules the bacteria were making that might have antibiotic properties. But that's the part of our lab that we just can't do that over distance learning. So we shifted in some other things.
Yeah. Phil, what are some of the things that you're paying attention to? What's giving you hope? What are you excited about right now living through a pandemic?
So what's giving me hope? I think what's giving me hope is that we are seeing scientists in the news and on in public platforms in a way that we don't often see. And so to some extent, that's a useful tool to build scientific literacy among the public, right? Yes. Used in the right way. And I think we're seeing it used both in the right way and in the wrong way by politicians at this point. But I think that seeing more people who are conveying information that is based on peer review, or at least the scientific method, is an important piece of, that's giving me some hope. The other thing that gives me hope is that we're seeing a little bit of the breakdown of partisan divides around this. Not everywhere, but you're seeing that in places like Ohio, right? Mike DeWine, the governor, I think it's DeWine, who's the governor of Ohio, is, you know, a Republican who has been very out front in sort of listening to public health officials and put a lot of the social distancing measures in place early on. And to the extent that we can, the more we have sort of bipartisan agreement on these things, the more we see coronavirus as sort of a national threat, as a threat to the human race, as opposed to a sort of an othering or a threat to someone else, that tends to break down partisan divides and polarization. Not completely by any means, but I think we're starting to see pieces of that. So I think there's hope in some of the people who've been brought forward into sort of the media, and then just, you know, some people from both sides of the political divide working together to sort of combat this, that I think can have long-term positive effects for American politics.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I just saw I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, Phil. So I have a note from Larkin for Kristen. Thank you for pointing out the pause that's been placed on non-COVID-19 research. That acknowledgement is really important. Phil, I think it's important for us to recognize the ways that people are coming together, and thinking about how we still are missing people within that too. That's an important thing to think about. So, so Ron, we've got our last few minutes here. Ron, what are you looking at these days, thinking about these days?
Yeah, I mean, I've been, as I've said before, like really heartened by the ways in which people have started to use the technology that's been here all along to solidify connections with one another or to rekindle them. I was telling someone before, I have a brother who I don't get to talk to very often, and he's just sort of reached out to me because of this event, just to see how it was and that sort of thing. And that's the sort of human connection that I think I want to see come out of this. And I'm not sure if we hadn't had such an awful, tragic event, that so many of us would have recognized that we were taking sort of many of our relationships for granted, right? And so that is hopeful for me above all else. And then in terms of the pandemic itself, I think just that at some point we are starting to get used to what is happening here. And to me, there's a sort of beauty in the adaptation that we're starting to show that we actually can keep going, we can keep moving, despite something that we know is sort of terrible. It's starting to wear on some of us, I think, but you know, at least we're talking to each other a lot more than we ordinarily would have. So that's less of a sort of policy thing and more of a just my sense as I look around and all the people I encounter. I mean, I'm getting emails from people who I haven't spoken to in ages. I'm getting phone calls from people. I don't know. There's something about that makes me hopeful that even if this is prolonged, that when we come out on the other side, something really, really wonderful in terms of our relations to one another will also come out with us. So that's where I am.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of our second week when our provost, Eric Boynton, was talking about the disruption and how the disruption reveals the interconnectedness of what we're experiencing. And so I think that's really starting to show in some interesting ways right now.
Yeah,
so,
right on.
And what I'm looking forward to is I'm looking forward to more data. I cannot stop looking at all of the predictive models, all of the that Johns Hopkins dashboard. If you haven't seen that, it's a daily update on where we're at. I'm looking forward to supposedly we're at the peak according to a lot of models. This week is it. supposedly. And so I'm hopeful that we'll start to see a decrease in the daily counts. And so that's what I'm really, really stuck on these days. And so, yeah, so, well,
Are we out of time?
we've just reached the end, but do you have a last, go ahead, Phil.
No, I have a sort of a question / comment on
Sure.
data.
Sure.
Which is, I think that we've seen such a good use of data, it a lot, like data visualization, right? Leslie would be so happy that we're talking about data visualization, right? We're seeing data visualization. But I wonder, sort of, my sort of general, maybe last comment / question is, when we start moving into things like contact tracing, we're seeing things like Apple and Google partnering together to use GPS data.
Yes.
And we're going, I think we're going to move away. I think we're going to start to see a little bit more distrust or fear of that. And I don't know where all of you are sort of standing on this idea of, there's something different, right? It feels different than saying, like, here's hospitalization, here's tests, here's this anonymized data versus here's your cell phone. Who have you been within 6 feet of? That seems really different, even though it seems in some sense vital to either the mitigation or the suppression strategy.
Oh man, we could go for like 6 more hours on this.
I'm like, Phil, why? Why did you do this? Because now I'm like, oh my God, yes, we should be talking about this. Well,
all right, so that just means Ron.
Here.
Yeah, Ron, we just need to start. I mean, we've got that opens up a can of worms. I mean, it's really fascinating because the data that we have is so incomplete, right? Yeah. Part of what they're talking about with the Google and Apple collaboration to look for Bluetooth next to each other is because contact tracing is time and people intensive. And
extremely difficult.
Yeah, and it's so hard, but yet we've got all of this data, and I'm somebody who I pay attention to, and I actually use a lot of the tracking data on my phone. So sorry, Robin, I have all of the tracking data options on my phone. And I look at it regularly, but anyhow, it's
and contact tracing requires people to believe and give truthful answers, right?
Yes, it does.
And that works in some societies better than others, depending on the way that the pandemic has been pitched, right? It has been framed.
Well, so this tells me that one of our next episodes needs to have somebody who talks about data and data visualization, because I think that if you're into data visualization and like to see things laid out, I cannot get enough of the New York Times and the way that they're presenting data and walking you through, here's what's on the x-axis, here's what's on the y-axis. Check that out. There's some really, really good resources out there. Washington Post has had a few really good simulators out there. There's a lot of European health or European Centers for Disease Control data that's being used in really exciting ways. And so I think that, Phil, you've pointed out there's 2 sides to that. The data that we have is amazing, but there's some questions about privacy. So with that, before we launch into our 14th hour of this show, I do want to say thank you again to our guests. Thank you to everybody who sent in questions. If you have questions during the week that you'd like us to think about, you can email me and Ron. Our email addresses we can be contacted through the Beloit College website. And a reminder that we have a special episode tomorrow for Community Day. It's Alumni Day. We have 5 alums. We're very excited about 3 of them will be live.
Yes.
And so we'll be talking with them about their experiences, where they're at right now in the COVID-19 outbreak. So what are you doing this next week, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna keep reading Leviathan Wakes, and I'm gonna keep pushing on with that. And yeah, we'll figure. I'll probably come up with a new quarantini.
Excellent. Phil, what are you doing this week?
We are working our way through all of the various things that are stockpiled in our freezer and finding new ways to make new. We got to the point where there is no room in the chest freezer, and we said, okay, we are good. And this was not really a pandemic problem. This was a pre-pandemic storage issue. So we are making new things out of new recipes.
Excellent. And Kristen, what are you doing this week?
I guess I'll say I'm going to check the weather, but I might start vegetable garden, some of the cool weather vegetables that might be able to survive.
Nice.
Awesome.
And I'm also going to help get my students through advising week and register for their module courses in the fall.
Yes,
Yeah.
yay for flight mods! Yay! And I'm gonna go for a run first. That's the first thing that I'm gonna do, and then I've got some home improvement projects that I'd like to get started. I don't have any time. It's advising week, but you know, it's always nice to have something to dream about. So. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. And thank you for those of you who were able to come. It was really, really nice to see names in the watch party. And we hope that you can join us again tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.